Well, occasionally the music kind of drops in right away when I need it to, and it ends on a track, but not today. It didn't end. Hey, everybody, welcome to the Church Digital Podcast. I am not Jeff Reed. There was some music happening in the background. I am joined by two handsome fellows. First, we want to say hello to everybody on Twitch and on YouTube. Yes, Jason, you are handsome. Yes, Dr. Warren Bird, you are also handsome. We have Phantom Mythos, and we have Dear Fedge, Jeff Reed in the chat. Jeff is supposed to be hosting this. We're praying for him. He's had a little bit of like a health thing happening. He's able to watch us on the internet. Everybody wave to Jeff. Thanks for joining us, Jeff. Thanks for allowing us to be here. But enough about me and everything that's happening on the Church Digital Podcast. We've got a live stream happening on Twitch and YouTube. And I am going to back out of the way and kind of introduce our two amazing guests. First off, to that side over there. By the way, I am a professional streamer, and I do know which way to point on camera. To my right on the screen over there is Mr. Captain Jason Morris over there of Church Digital fame, of Westside, of everything, of Resi fame. I feel like you are the man that kind of needs no introduction on the internet. Do you want to give us like a list of your plaudits, or do you want me to just keep going to Warren? Which is going to make you feel more awkward?
No, it's not worth it. I just feel like one of the things I do say though is I feel like Warren has kind of figured out, he'll be able to introduce himself. Warren has kind of figured out his life purpose and what he brings to the table for the kingdom. And I wanted to be kind of like him in that way. So I feel like my life's purpose, what I bring to the kingdom is I'd leverage the collective digital might of Jesus Church towards achieving global gospel saturation.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I do, and it's had a lot of different expressions over the years, but that's just the way that Jesus made me. So I don't make an apology for that. But I want to hear from Warren.
Yeah, so the guy who is kind of below us needs no introduction, but if we do need an introduction, Dr. Warren Bird, you are also of like a million different things. The VP of Research over at ECFA. My goodness, I feel I met Warren actually. Well, I experienced. Let's put it that way. I experienced Warren at Exponential 2024, and it was in a tent. I don't know if you remember this, Warren. It was in a tent. It was about 1,000 degrees outside. We were doing like a panel or something. There was like 3 or 4 other guys there.
And if you put on the fan, you drown everybody out.
Exactly. And so we were
blow their hair.
we were playing this like game of like, do we keep the air conditioning on or do we be able to hear? And so it was like that was me. Like I had to run out and like kick the breaker on and come back in. Warren, he was wearing, I think, the same sweater vest that he's wearing now, or at least a version of that. He was wearing pants, like khaki pants. And he had more energy than anybody in that tent, was immune to the heat. He must have been a missionary in sub-Saharan Africa somewhere because he was used to it. Dr. Warren Bird, thank you so much for joining us on the Church Digital podcast today. How has life been for you so far?
Andy, I've never had an introduction like that. And
You're welcome.
I will long remember that. And Jason, I love your mission statement. This is like global impact for the gospel. And here's my run in it. And that's very exciting.
Absolutely.
And I feel like along the way, I don't know if you remember, this is probably back in 2010, 2011, something like that. That's when we met. It was at a LeadNet gathering or something like that. And we sat down and talked about, leveraging Google Ads and things like that back in the day. And what I loved
back
about
in the day when that was a new topic, that was
exactly
a breakthrough idea. Yeah,
exactly. And so what I love as I've been following you is the way in which you are contributing with data for the kingdom and your mind for that sort of thing. And what have you written or co-written 30 books or something?
Whoa,
I don't know.
35, but who's counting?
Okay. Right. Exactly. Right. And you've got, what I've heard is you've got a new book that I didn't know about that's coming out that you said just came out or is coming out or something like that, that has some digital components to it.
Becoming a Future Ready Church with 3 authors, Daniel Yang, Gen Xer, Adele Banks, a Gen Wire or millennial, and myself, a boomer, talking about 8 forks in the road that every church has got to deal with. We're more comfortable with the year 1950 when the church was at a heyday than we are at the year 2050, but we're a lot closer to 2050. And like Wayne Gretzky with the hockey puck. Well, Wayne, how'd you win so many awards? Well, I don't go to where the hockey puck is. I go to where it's gonna be.
Yep.
And if we as a church can discern where is culture moving and how do we speak the gospel, unchanging gospel, in a way that the rising generation and the culture they're imbibing will be able to hear, then the gospel impact will be multiplied. And frankly, if we stay with 1950, that year might not be coming back too soon.
It's not. Spoiler.
Yeah, totally agree with you there.
Spoiler.
And we were supposed to talk about this article, but I don't care about that anymore for right now. You said that you mentioned 8 things. I haven't read this book yet because I didn't know. I was waiting for it to come out, but I did hear the talk that you gave with Daniel on one of the sessions that in my mind was just spot on. And so I want to hear what insights you have on those 8 things. Before we even get to the article and all these other things that I had planned, I want to hear about this.
Well, but let me just set it up with 1 Samuel 17 with David about to head out to Goliath, and he comes to King Saul. And King Saul says, look, I got the best armor in the country. I'm the king. I got the best, everything in the country. I'm giving it to you, buddy, because what's won my battles are going to win your battles. And David says, these aren't tested by me. I don't know these. I'm not comfortable in them. I'm really comfortable with a whole different methodology. Same giant, same goal that we want to, take care of Goliath, but I want to do it a whole different way. And Saul blessed him and said, okay, you don't have to wear my armor. You don't have to do this. I'm going to let you take this sling and a few pebbles, and all of Israel is riding on it. May God be with you, buddy. And that's really what the next generation can say to the current generation, to say, thank you so much for all these wonderful institutions and patterns and stuff that we've inherited. I get the gospel. I'm not going to leave the gospel. I get scripture. I'm not going to change that. But how we communicate it, the vehicles we use, has to change. And the whole book is about the conversations around 8 of those changes that need to happen intergenerationally, lest the next generation say, I don't know what to do with all this stuff. We don't need it. It's not going to help us reach our lost friends. So
Warren, on that real quick, and I know we have like other things to get to. Do you find that there is
the other thing?
Yeah. We're going to keep saying that and just pushing it out. Do you feel that there's almost, so in tech? I'm highly online. I'm technically a millennial, but I'm also the creative pastor for a completely digital church. I find that I work a lot. I've got kind of an engineering and IT background as well. And what IT people and engineers talk about is tech debt, where you continually program things and you don't ever really kind of clean up the cruft. You just code over it until you have so much of this kind of coded over tech that you have to go back and clean it up. And that's called tech debt. Are you finding there's almost kind of like a tradition debt in church right now, almost like a liturgy debt? I get that's probably like the wrong term for it. Are you finding something of that, or are you finding it's more that the next generations are so quick to just transition into like fluid spaces that we just don't know how to talk to them right now?
I love your term tech debt, and I think your latter comparison is better, but it's not like it's a yesterday today shift. This is a shift over time. For example, if you ask people in church of all ages, how many of you read your scripture, the Bible this week, and did so online, meaning on a computer, on an app, on your smartphone? Almost all the hands will go up.
Yeah.
And yet that same audience, if you say to them, is digital discipleship the future? They're going to go like, I don't know. There's something about being in this room where I'm not sure. So one of the pastors I interviewed for what we're eventually going to talk about, Kyle Ransom at Cincinnati Crossroads, said, look, isn't that what the Apostle Paul did with the New Testament? It's like, hey, I really want to be with you in person. I get being in person is really important and helpful, but I can't. So I'm going to write you a letter. I'm going to explain what to do for discipleship, and I want you to follow this. And then when I get there, we'll talk about it some more. So even there, in his generation, it's a mixture of online. Well, in his case, it was, the printed letter that's read to people, and in person. And the two were integrating. And so today, have we figured out how to value each piece of that integration?
That's good. Well, let's make the turn then. Hold on, Jason. I just want to make sure we make this turn before we keep saying like, oh, let's push this out. Let's push this out. Let's push this out. So, so the kind of this article that has been being talked about here, I'm actually going to post it in all of our chats. If you are listening to this via podcast or watching it on VOD or on YouTube later, you'll be able to find this in the show notes. Warren, you authored essentially a manifesto, I'm going to call it, about the things that are kind of changing in the church. And the title of it is Digital Discipleship, Can Churches Grow People Who May Never Attend in Person? Now, like you were just saying there, Warren, that feels almost like a shot across the bow, but I don't think it actually is. Where did the genesis for this article kind of come from?
Well, it came in part from talking with people like Jason and a whole bunch of others. And we went through this pandemic and all these churches went digital. And now as they're able to gather in person and build momentum there, so many of them are questioning, well, do we really, what is the value added by the digital component? And there have been a couple of high visibility examples of churches that said, no, we're killing our streaming totally. If you want to connect with us, you got to be here in person. But there's a small group of churches that went the opposite direction, that said, thank you, Jesus, for opening up the world as our parish. And how can we disciple anyone, anywhere? So, in fact, that's to come back to Crossroads. They call their online campus Crossroads Anywhere. And actually in-house, they call it Crossroads in Your Underwear, because, you don't necessarily need to be dressed. Well, Jason, you're standing up where we could see you, but the rest of us, we could be in our pajama bottoms for all you know. And there was one meme early in the internet where that's just what happened with one of the meetings. But at any rate, I thought, okay, let me find these pioneers and ask them where they're struggling and where they're finding breakthroughs. Because what so often happens, I know from kind of the innovation curve and all, that and this happens in all of life too, that you have people who try this and you try that and try that, and eventually somebody finds a path that works, and then a larger group starts saying, well, duh, of course, haven't we always done it that way? And no, we haven't. But the pioneers are the ones who are learning. So I started with like Outreach 100's list of fastest growing churches. I thought, well, if anyone has cracked the nut, and then I asked a lot of people, Andy, I asked you, I asked Mark Lutz, I asked Jason, who do you know that's making serious progress with digital discipleship? Then I figured out emails, and we did kind of an online panel forum to say, so what do you want to know from your peers? Because right now there's not a term, there's not wording, there's not clear leaders of the pack. There's not kind of a watering hole that this is where we all gather to share our ideas, as eventually happens with most movements. And I thought, okay, let me find who those people are and ask them what they want to know about each other. And then I built that into a survey. I sent the survey to them in a larger group, and 112 churches that, in my view, qualified gave their answer. And by qualified is they either had more people online than in person, or like Andy, for you, that's pretty easy because you have 0 in person. Or they said they're growing fast. And I didn't mean that as a put down, because there are, in fact, in the book, Becoming a Future Ready Church, we highlight one church that is entirely digital and the pros and cons of them as a future. But anyway, are we either growing faster online than in person, or are we having more people online and in person? And are we seriously committed, as evidenced by a full-time staff member, if you're larger, or one of other evidences, to doing digital well? And of those, I asked him a whole bunch of questions. And that's where 3 reports came out, the first of which went into Outreach Magazine. The other 2 of which, if you'd like to download them, just go to ecfa.org/surveys, and they're right there at the top of the page. And it's ECFA, as in the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability, who was the sponsor of this. And you say, well, why were they the sponsor of this? Well, it's because we're all about building trust so that the world can be evangelized. And in a certain way, and we'll get to this, people are giving money online who aren't coming in person. And, is this, if you will, a new fundraising, and I don't mean that in a cheap way, but a new way of fueling discipleship for funding the ministry. And we'll come back to that when we do eventually talk about this article. But anyway, the backdrop was just as fun as taking the findings, because I got to knock on a bunch of doors and find a bunch of trailblazers and pioneers. And that was a way long answer. I won't do long answers like that for the rest of it.
No, that's okay, Warren. That's why we had you on. What I find fascinating is your initial question that you had brought up, do you read the scriptures digitally? And the answer to that is yes. One could argue that is a big piece of digital discipleship. Another piece of digital discipleship, instead of digital fundraising, in my mind, that's a little different. To go back to your EFCA conversation or ECFA conversation, if you look at online giving as a step of obedience, as a step of discipleship, then you can also say, well, you kind of are doing digital discipleship. You just don't know it yet.
Yes.
You're reading the Bible digitally. You're giving digitally. There's a few things left that you could probably do digitally for digital discipleship, but I don't know of any church that is so rabid about their physical gathering and the physical expression of church that they would be willing to be intellectually consistent and cut off their digital giving for that philosophical difference. I don't know of many. And because of that, in my mind, that proves all the more that digital discipleship, at least in some forms, is not only valid, but it's already happening. Yeah. And if the market if the market is already wanting this to happen and we're resisting it, what could it do if we went with what the Spirit is already doing? That
yes. And if that's where people live their lives, I mean, this is what Second Life and all this online stuff did. And what
right.
I've never done a podcast. This is my first one on this Twitch forum. And when I mentioned Twitch as an illustration to someone and said, well, do you know how many millions of people use Twitch? Like, whoa, this is like a whole different world of people who connect to the ecosystem. And that's the point.
Yep.
So Jesus said, I got other cities to go to. Take the gospel there. And he ended up saying, take it to the ends of the earth. Well, why wouldn't that include going to gamers on Twitch? If that's where they hang out just as much as hanging out at the bar. Like, my wife and I are discipling, we do apprentice couples for like Bible study groups we lead. And, our next meeting with our apprentice couple is going to be online because they're going to put their kids in bed. They don't have to get a babysitter and all. They plop down on the sofa together and and my wife and I can talk. Well, that's going to be no less a discipleship than had they gotten a sitter and we met, at a restaurant or the church or anything, because that hybrid world of back and forth is now so seamless. This is how people live their lives. So why can't we figure out how we do church and outreach as well?
I'm totally with you. And to go back to your other point on, I think it's 2 John 12, if I'm not mistaken, where John's like, I'm writing you with pen and ink. I long to be with you face to face so that our joy can be full. He's mentioning in the first century that same tension that everyone feels in the hybrid environment, where you have this ministry that you're doing remotely, and at the same time you want to be together, but you can't. And so what do? You do both. That's what you do. Because it didn't keep John from sending the letter, and John had no idea of the reach and longevity of what he was writing that we can benefit from today, because he was thinking in his mind, oh, I want to be with you face to face so that our joy can be full. Well, full for who? For John and his buddies, not for me 2,000 years later in a completely different country. But because he took the time to do both with hybrid discipleship, using the digital, it's not using the technology of his day at his time. Now I get the benefit of it. And the way in which digital technologies can get multiplied for outreach is crazy. So I want to go into this outreach article, in question number one, or this manifesto that you made. One of the very first statements that you said was online ministry can be spiritually fruitful for any church, because a lot of times pastors are thinking, well, I'm not big like, Life Church or Church Home or Crossroads that we mentioned. You know, this works really well for larger churches, particularly multi-site churches that already have somewhat of the technology in place and they can do online stuff. But what you're saying here is that this online ministry can actually work for any church. So tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, one of the examples I bumped into in researching this was a very small church of largely immigrants from a country where Christianity is illegal, and here in the they are here in the United States, and
Yes.
the guy married someone from a different country, and I was talking to him about his online ministry, and he's like, there are other groups just like us in pockets around the world, from this
Hmm.
country where we have two different nationalities represented that historically didn't get along, but because I married someone they do, and we've found incredible fellowship in the gospel. And I'm just thinking, oh God, this is just so. We didn't need an airplane to go fly or money.
Right.
All we needed was the internet, and this relative who spoke to this relative who spoke to this friend and said, oh, let me connect you with this church in this and to think, man, is that possible? I first got that idea on Easter 2020 when we were all shut down, and I thought, more people are going to hear the gospel this month than at any time in human history, because this small
Hmm.
Cambodian church in New York City is broadcasting their service, and everybody's doing it in their
Hmm.
language and culture, and it's out there now. And how exciting that the gospel can be spread. So so that's the experiential answer that a church of any size. The survey actually asked that question and said,
Hmm.
do you believe that you have to have an app in order to have effective online discipleship, that you have to have a certain size or staff commitment to do so? And the answer is no. And the one thing I always encourage churches when I see, like, I was part of a church plant years ago, and we had what we called an overflow room, not a good term. And I wish you could have seen the jerry-rigged cameras where one guy bought this from his home, and these patch cables that were duct taped
Oh
on and
my
all.
word, I've seen it all
You
too.
really need to take a picture of this, because the humble beginning had vision, and it led
Hmm.
to, and it's going to lead to, and the church did grow and eventually was able to pony up and buy some real equipment and everything. But it wasn't that the money led the vision, it was the vision led the money, and the vision
Hmm.
was, let's use the tools we've got to get where we are. And it's just so inspiring to me to see that churches of every size are able to figure out okay, so I'm going to take my iPhone and we're going to clip it here, and okay, not ideal, but it works. And if
Hmm.
it helps grow and strengthen the body of Christ, then keep doing it. Let's see where it goes.
Yeah, I just came back from Korea, being at Lausanne, the Congress there. And what fascinated me was, with all of the research that they were showing on global shifts between now and 2050, very similar to what you're describing. What really stood out to me was the parts of the world that are now being connected to the internet with smartphones and that higher level of connectivity is happens to be the same parts of the world where there is so much persecution against the church. which happens to be the same groups of people that are migrating as refugees all around the world. I don't think that those things converging are by accident. To your point with your story right there, I believe that Jesus is setting us up for global world evangelism in ways that have never been able in human history like they are right now. Not to mention that because you can minister to persecuted places at so much lower risk and cost to both the missionary as well as the person who's exploring matters of faith like never before. Not to mention the fact, and here's something to think about too, because was a I'm a former missionary, right? My heart beats for a certain part of the world, and I can still be a missionary right where I am right now, just north of Austin, Texas, without changing anything.
Isn't that
That to
awesome?
me, it is. What
Not to
about the
mention that he's
latent
probably across the street
potential?
from you.
Exactly. Exactly. What about the latent potential of all
Yeah.
ex-missionaries, former pastors that are in the States, Canada, in the developed world, still have a heart for mission and are now able to minister to the emerging connected world like never before? That happens to be the world that is also being persecuted for their faith, and to do it in a way that is low risk. I mean, come on, let's get the job done. I love this conversation. Now,
Yeah.
when we talk
Now,
about
now, now
outreach,
that said, in every development of innovation, there's always there's always someone who asks the following question. And in some ways, I want to validate it that it's appropriate. And the question is, but what are the toxic side effects
oh,
if we make
sure.
this shift
Oh,
and we give up certain things, or what is it that we're going to lose? And I appreciate people asking those questions. In a certain way, you have to not put the brakes on the trailblazers and pioneers to say, well, okay, let's get everything all
mhm,
figured out, because you'd never go anywhere. But
mhm.
you do have to ask those questions. But for the meantime, to your first point from the article, can any size church have a digital discipleship impact? Enthusiastic, yes. We should probably
Yes,
move to the second point,
yes, yes. Let's go to the second
or
one.
people are going to
Um,
decide we're pointless.
I love you.
yes, we can go to the second one. Um, yeah, I'll save some of my commentary for later because there's a few little nuggets in there. The second one is one of the hardest nuts to crack is connecting online participants into relationships. Anyone who's done online ministry knows exactly what this means.
Can I get an
And
amen from everybody in the back, please?
yes, yes. So Warren, tell us about your survey and your findings there,
Okay, so
particularly if there's
you
folks who have
you
overcome it.
said you said anyone online can say an amen, but it's actually anyone who's ever been to an in-person gathering of any kind.
No,
Touche.
it's the same. It's the same
It's
problem. Yes.
exactly the same. I got these people, here, and their body is here, and
Mhm.
they and I'm preaching up a storm, and then they go away, and it's like,
Right.
what happened? How does the Holy Spirit use our venue and circumstances and the power of the Word of God and all the other things that happen to prompt people to take that next step? Now, of course, in person, you have a leg up in that you can say, all right, I'm going to run back to the door and grab that guy before he goes out the door and say, hey, I got a tattoo like yours, or whatever that helps me start a conversation. And online, you don't have that at all. However,
Yeah.
I was so impressed by all the churches saying, well, for those who give, we do know about them. For those who we do an
Mhm.
after service gathering, and I always ask everybody 3 questions, like, what's your name, where are you from, and something about yourself. And over time, people begin to share, or we have an online Bible study of some kind or prayer group of some kind, and we need to exchange emails in order to be part of it. And churches that work at it can, and especially those who are relationally in tuned as the online pastor or equivalent or volunteer leader, can begin to say, oh, you're Charlie, right? And last week we prayed for your daughter. Do you mind telling us how she is? And what's her name, by the way? And, tell us a little bit about your family. And as that trust begins to grow, you build community. It's harder, but this is where software, which in itself is a digital thing, can help us to track who's in the room and how they are processing in their discipleship journey. Just an interesting side note. I asked 2 questions in the survey about discipleship journey. I said, one, how would you rate the clarity and effectiveness of your discipleship pathway for your in-person attenders? And nobody gave it top marks. They all were like, it was
Yes.
and so they're all like, okay, we're at maybe 7 or 6 or 5 or whatever. But then I asked the same question about their digital discipleship pathway, and the only commonality is it was always lower. So in other words, we're not doing the best job in person, but we're doing an even worse job online.
Oh, well, that makes total sense because digital things, online stuff tends to be a force multiplier for whatever you're doing. It just magnifies it. If it's good, it'll magnify it. If it's weak, it'll magnify that too. So that actually doesn't surprise me. And it kind of goes back to what I'm looking at here on the third thing that you mentioned is that churches, just in general, aren't clear about their discipleship pathway, let alone the online pathway. So if you don't have clarity physically, online is not going to fix it for you.
Exactly. And the strategies should feed each other. The things that we're learning about, like one church runs the same marriage strengthener over and over, but every time they try a different title for it. They even got ChatGPT to, here's what we're doing. Help me come up with a better title. And then they measure how many people sign up for it. Well, they came up with 21 days to a better marriage, as that's what people will sign up for in droves. Well, if that's what works in person, does that also work as a connector online, which they tried and it did. So the two worlds really need to feed each other in figuring out how do we do this discipleship pathway well.
Yeah, totally with you. They're synergistic, doing them together. And you find that even in the New Testament, it's really not a new strategy at all. Let's move to
but just before we move, I had several open-ended questions for give us your best idea about whatever.
Oh yeah, and what were those?
The good news is none of them were rocket science. None of them were like, oh, nobody has ever thought of that idea. No wonder. I didn't even reproduce them in a list because it's like, well, yeah. I mean, sure, you just figure out how people want to be connected and you connect them. And
exactly.
So,
yeah,
okay,
ready for the next point. At the end of the day, what you have, and this is, I think, what you're surfacing, Warren, is so insightful because for whatever reason, I don't know why this is, but people feel like, oh, if you're doing digital church, it's got to be radically different, the way in which you relate to people. But at the end of the day, it's just people ministering to people. That's it. And that has never changed. And that's something that Jesus set up from the very beginning. We're just using newer tools. That's all.
Yeah.
And the same needs that people have are going to be true, whether you're in a physical environment or a digital one. It doesn't matter.
I agree, but this is where the book comes in, becoming a future-ready
Okay.
church, in the sense that people's needs are the same, and but different needs get accentuated at different times. Like right now, you can't go a day
Uh,
without hearing something about emotional health, mental health,
right. Sure.
loneliness, anxiety, and all. Well,
Sure.
there was an era in the church that was really a low
Yeah.
point of need or awareness or willingness to talk about it in society.
Yeah.
Today, if I start with that, I get all kinds of responses. Or to use
Hmm.
another analogy, if I'm talking to you about my church, maybe 20 years ago, if I say, "Oh, we have this killer youth program and children's program, and we have a handbell choir," let's say that the 20 and
Hmm.
maybe that was a point of resonance that people go, "Oh, cool! I'd like to come to your church. I'd love my children to be part of a handbell choir or whatever." Today, now back then, if you had said, "And we volunteer at the nearby soup kitchen," people would have gone, "Nah, I don't know if I want." Now, some people would have thrived on that.
Hmm.
Today, that's a great front door. We're the church that
Yeah.
sponsors the soup kitchen, that meets our community's needs in both physically and spiritually. We treat the whole person, and come be part of it. Well, that's a great entry point. And so, while the needs are always the same, what the response level and the words and the values and how we approach them are different. And that's all part of things you can experiment with both in person and online. I mean, we
Hmm.
talked earlier about Google Ads. Um,
Hmm.
take your sermon, have Chat GPT slice and dice it into different needs that are addressed, post those on the internet, just not, a sermon about 1 Samuel 17 slaying Goliath, but about anxiety in not feeling adequate, and see
Hmm.
which one people are searching for. Are the things people are searching for that the gospel speaks to, that your sermons speak to,
Hmm.
that you can point people to? And that's just a whole new way of thinking and addressing people's felt needs today.
Hmm.
So, Lauren, as you were talking, there was a couple of things that were mentioned in the chat that I did want to ask you about. When you did the survey, was it only U.S. churches?
Yes, yes.
Because,
I'm
okay.
sorry. I did talk to Steve Fogg in Australia, as was one of the many people I
Hmm.
interviewed, and
Hmm.
Dave Adamson. As long as I'm hat tipping Australia, I talked, I think, to
Hmm.
3 people in Australia who got up at some ungodly hour to talk to me, because that's one of the hardest. And I talked
Right.
to Canada. Talked to people. Just I owe Carrie Newhoff an email reply
Right.
today. He's spoken to, so, but I only surveyed U.S. churches.
Okay. Because one of the interesting things that you just described is um, digital stuff doesn't really matter.
Hmm.
No one really cares what country it's from.
Hmm.
And so if it works, it works. And what I love about your approach is a little bit more casting a wide net of different ways in which you can package the content that meets a felt need, wherever that might be. I know that in some cases, we've done things like that, and it springs up in the most random places. Like the way that things are crafted really resonate well for folks in Germany, but not so much in the United States. And it's fascinating to see how sometimes the content in which we're already creating can resonate in different parts of the world
Yeah.
in a global sense, even though we don't have data for that necessarily. I've anecdotally found that to be true. One of the moving on to like assertion four that you had, churches want their online attenders to connect with in-person church whenever possible. This was where I felt like, okay, as a digital person, I don't really care. I think Andy probably feels the same way, where we don't really have an in-person thing that we need to maintain. It's something that the in-person church is the nice to have. It's the add-on. It's the cherry on top, not the main course of what we do. And I'm curious of the people that, because you mentioned, doing the survey with a lot of digital churches, was there a segment in which there were differences in opinion on this particular topic?
Yeah, there sure was. And Jason, very discerning question. I ask, are you trying to reach people largely in your geographic area?
Mm.
And there was a bit of a fork in the road in that some churches are saying, this is our focus. We want to try to reach people in this metropolitan area or community or whatever. And predictably, if that's what you're focusing on, it's much easier to gather people in person to say, hey, we're doing a serve project for this needy area. Why don't all of you who are connected with us that are within a reasonable drive show up at this school or park or whatever you're trying to do to serve your community in Jesus' name. Others have the philosophy of, no, we want to make this so that anyone who connects can just as fully participate. And so therefore we need to make everything have a full orbed parallel for what we can offer in person. Now, that's a challenge. Giving a hug in person, I get how to do that. How to do hugs online, that gives a few challenges. But sharing coffee online, I may not be able to stand up at the same coffee urn, but we can all hold up our coffee cups and figuratively clank and everything else online. So what can you do online that replaces or that substitutes for things that are readily done in person? And what can digital do best or even better than in person? What can in person do better? And can we just agree that it's never going to be fully parallel? And I think the jury is out on all this. And I don't want to tell anyone, Mr. or Mrs. Edison, you cannot invent that light bulb because this is how discoveries are made.
Exactly. And I feel like churches like Lux, churches that are using the digital expression of the two in hybrid, using the digital expression as the primary expression of church, they're the ones that are discovering how powerful the digital tools are, and at the same time are well aware of the weaknesses that can be bolstered by occasional in-person gatherings that don't necessarily have to be every week. They could be, here's the interesting thing. You have in the Old Testament a very similar pattern where you had the children of Israel that had a identity around following God, but they didn't get together every week. Not as a nation, they didn't. Not as a big gathering. They did get together in homes to celebrate Shabbat every Saturday, right? But that was just their family together. That wasn't their identity as a nation, but they did have feast days. So, it was like once a month-ish where they would do these big feast days and have gatherings in tribes or gathering as the nation. And I'm looking at the Old Testament and I'm thinking, wow, how genius is that particular ministry design for connectedness, belonging, and of all of the people who over the millennia have maintained their national identity and national cohesion, it's the Jews. Without a weekly expression where everybody has to get together. And
I know we need to land the plane. We're in our final minutes, but my community has become predominantly Hasidic Jewish. The hat, the curls.
Oh, cool.
Really?
Yeah.
And that's exactly what we marvel at. That they have the meetings in the small minyan of 10 men gathering, and then they have these incredible high energy gatherings, some for worship, some bar mitzvahs or other gatherings.
Right.
But that community is so tight. It's amazing.
Yeah, it really is. I feel like
when you said that, I'm just like looking out my window and thinking, yep, that's the case here too. Okay, let's land the plane.
Well, yes. We'll get to the last one. Churches project a big rise in online giving beyond those who attend in person. This is fascinating. This might be the gateway drug for online ministry, I think.
Well, prior to the pandemic, I and others had done research that validated something that would not be a surprise to anyone, that the more involved you are in a church, the more you give. So if you're a greeter and you lead a small group and your kids are involved in the youth group and all that, your likelihood of giving is far higher than if I'm a fringe person who just occasionally attends on Sunday.
Right.
What about online? And from what we can tell, not just from our survey, did very little on it, but one called Epic, exploring the pandemic implications for churches, found the same thing, that the more involved online you are, the more online you give. And again, this is preliminary, but it raises the question of, could we do a better job of discipling our online participants? And if we did, in discipling them financially and in generosity, then could their generosity increase? And could it be, and I'm just raising this as my concluding question, could it be that online becomes self-funding in a certain way, because those being reached and discipled then fund that aspect of the ministry? And again, jury's out, but I'm raising that question, and I'd love to see if this is a new way of funding by developing generosity as a discipleship trait, funding the mission of God's church.
So I'm going to peel that onion just a second. When we're not going to go deep into this because we haven't really revealed this to the church yet. So there's nobody watching it. There's nobody listening to this. It's just us two. Don't worry about it. But the idea of generosity is something that Lux is going into its fourth year. March of 2025 will be its fourth year.
Congratulations.
It's like, for God to sustain a church, any sort of church plant that long it's a miracle.
Yeah.
It's through the work of Mark. It's also through the work of the Holy Spirit kind of inundating our church. I've been in with them for it'll be 2.5 years now. And one of the things that I've seen is an actual increase in generosity. And that's only because we've talked about it. I think what happens online a lot of times right now is that we are inundated with, hey, give $10 to this thing, buy my Patreon, or subscribe to my Patreon. Hey, give me $15 to this influencer, yada, yada, yada. And there's a culture built around almost tipping. And we have had to actively push back against that and say, no. God's church, not necessarily, doesn't demand, because that's very forceful and draconic and all that, but God's church is substantive in a way that the internet is not. And that means that we need to pay bills, but also we need money to actually do things that are going to fund the spread of the gospel, be it giving to an orphanage in Uganda, which we're doing. We're giving many thousands of dollars to orphanages in Uganda, or whether it's just simply like, keeping the lights on in the studios. And
Or
we are
taking
having
care of people in need in your digital church.
that's where I was going with that, is that now we're getting to the point where we can actually start sending meals to people, and we can start door dashing things to people that have had surgeries. And we've always been able to do it nickel and diming, but we've now gathered up ahead of steam, where in this next year, our emphasis next year is going to be, it's the word home. And we're talking about the church as a home, and we're talking about digital church can be a home for you. And here's why. And we're, labeling all the rooms and doing the whole thing. It's this big thematic thing. Love it. But the idea of generosity is that, hey, if you are able to give whatever you're able to give, because most internet denizens, especially in the Lux area, are gamers, and gamers most of the time don't have a whole lot of moolah around, and that's fine. It's whatever the Lord lays on your heart to give. It's that act of generosity will spark other acts of generosity, which will then spark a growth of discipleship through the actual act of giving, and on and on and on. That's what we're seeing there.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
And the other thing that's interesting too, Warren, is in the prevailing model of church planting, you have to raise so much money to get the thing going initially that it creates an immense amount of pressure for the church planter to recover those funds, get critical mass, do all of those things. What's so great about digital church is that it allows the digital church planter to focus on what's really most important, and that is the digital relationships.
Preach.
Without that pressure and overhead, because the costs of doing a digital church are so much lower than what the prevailing model would ask of a church planter, that it allows them to launch lean in ways that your prevailing model just can't allow.
Yep.
And therefore, you can get to self-sustainability so much faster than would otherwise be possible.
Preach.
I totally agree. I'm going to make my final comment, because then I've got to break. As a caution, okay. It's easy to go lean in a way that says we're just going to be lean and not challenge people to discipleship. Say, okay, well, this is all we got, right, and so this is all we're going to spend. But what if you challenge people to develop their generosity muscles and still stay lean? How much more can you do? It's much like the bivocational church planner. Often, well, because I was depending on my income, I really didn't try to develop generosity as discipleship. In the church.
That's
now
fair.
that I'm shifting over to full time, I'm realizing we're not really that strong of a giving church, and I really haven't cultivated that in our people.
Yeah.
So
fair.
My caution is still press for press for generosity development, but still stay lean if you want, and avoid the church facility challenge.
Awesome.
Okay. I'm going to need to sign off. Is there any final word for me? Oh, other than me saying ecfa.org/surveys, you get 3 reports, free downloads if you'd like.
Give me the book one more time, Warren.
And the book is Becoming a Future Ready Church.
We love
by
it.
Daniel Yang, Adele Banks, and Warren Bird.
We love it. Warren, thank you. Jason, thank you.
ECFA loves churches. We love ministry. We love getting the gospel out. This is our investment. They're behind me doing this because they want to enhance trust in donors so that the Great Commission can be fulfilled.
We love it. Thank you, Warren, for being here. Thank you so much for just blessing us with all of your wisdom. Jason, thank you so much for being here. Everyone on Twitch and everyone on YouTube, thank you so much for being here. We will see you next time. Love you guys.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.